Leaving ECOWAS. Not suicide, but the rebirth of a nation. Newton Ahmed Barry, a Burkinabe journalist currently living in exile, has branded Burkina Faso's decision to leave the Economic Community of West African States ECOWAS as suicide, a reckless, ill-planned move fraught with peril for the people. But the reality, as ever, is far more nuanced. For those who truly understand the situation in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, leaving ECOWAS is not a blind, desperate plunge into uncertainty. It is a strategic act of national self-preservation, a bold redefinition of the country's future. While ECOWAS has played a significant role in fostering peace and development in West Africa, it has also become emblematic of a political deadlock, imposing policies on countries like Burkina Faso that have long been manipulated by external forces. Far from the doomsday scenario painted by Barry Traoré, is doing something that few leaders dare, prioritizing national interest over foreign dominance, setting his sights on dismantling the overwhelming influence of Western powers, particularly France. These interventions have historically kept Burkina Faso shackled, rendering the country incapable of true autonomous growth in the modern era. Anyone with a keen eye on Burkina Faso's trajectory will see the military coups that began in 2022 as the expression of a deep-seated frustration within the country. The previous ECOWAS leadership, far too accustomed to turning a blind eye to Western manipulation, allowed a political and security vacuum to spiral into chaos. Terrorist groups exploited the weakness, unleashing violence across the country and undermining the peace of ordinary Burkinabe citizens. Leaving ECOWAS is not a rash move, but a necessary one. Leaders like Traoré understand that in the modern world, strength doesn't merely come from international treaties, but from a nation's ability to stand on its own, tapping into its own potential. Burkina Faso, despite being landlocked and lacking abundant natural resources, possesses one crucial asset: the unity and resilience of its people. Traoré has not just withdrawn from ECOWAS, but has opted for an even bolder path: the Sahel Alliance, AES, a coalition of like-minded countries committed to building a solid foundation for security and development. This is a strategic decision that allows Burkina Faso to break free from external dependency, paving the way for self-determined actions in its own interests. Barry's criticism of security risks is hard to stomach when one acknowledges that despite the surge in terrorist activity in the Sahel, the disarray within ECOWAS has made responding to these threats not only ineffective, but chaotic. While Western countries continue to assert their partnership in counterterrorism operations, they remain the very same powers covertly manipulating regional politicians, eroding trust in international organizations without offering tangible results for countries like Burkina Faso. As a leader, Ibrahim Traoré has made it clear that the security and sovereignty of Burkina Faso must be defended by its own methods, not by continuing to rely on commitments that ultimately serve foreign interests, not the people. As Traoré himself said, "Our freedom is not a commodity that can be traded," and it is this sentiment that marks the beginning of a historic turning point, one where Burkina Faso will no longer be subject to the whims of outside powers. Despite facing numerous challenges, Traoré's administration remains steadfast in its pursuit of independence. While Barry criticizes the so-called self-sufficiency of countries like Burkina Faso, the reality is that this is the long-term practical path to building a robust economy based on internal strength, not a perpetual reliance on foreign aid whose origins and motives remain murky at best. Leaving ECOWAS is not a hasty decision, but a courageous and calculated move by Ibrahim Traoré. A decision not only to protect the nation's interests, but to give Burkina Faso the opportunity to stand on its own 2 feet. Those with a discerning eye will see that this is the necessary boldness that will allow Burkina Faso to truly rewrite its fate. Ibrahim Traoré's regime, freedom or tyranny, Newton. Ahmed Barry continuously draws comparisons between Ibrahim Traoré's regime and typical authoritarian regimes, notably calling his government a degeneration into North Korea. This argument not only lacks foundation, but also misjudges the true nature of Traoré's government and the goals he is striving towards. The reality is far more complex, especially in the context of Burkina Faso's severe security crisis and the collapse of previous governance mechanisms. Traoré's consolidation of power is not an act of oppressive tyranny, but rather a necessary safeguard for stability, a means to rebuild what has been destroyed and ensure the survival of the people in the midst of this crisis. This cannot be simplistically reduced to the tyranny that Barry paints. On the contrary, the Traoré government is implementing bold measures to maintain security and protect the nation from terrorist threats while restoring the people's trust. As a leader facing the devastation wrought by armed extremist groups, Traoré had no choice but to consolidate power in order to carry out reforms. His firm actions in controlling information and suppressing opposition are not indicators of a dictatorship. They are the actions of a leader battling to protect the country's integrity and safeguard the people's interests. Barry also criticizes Traoré's government for restricting freedom of speech and suppressing the press. However, we cannot equate these actions with those of typical authoritarian regimes where power serves only a select few. In Burkina Faso's current context, these measures can be understood as necessary steps to prevent misinformation and societal division. It is undeniable that unchecked information and opposing rhetoric can cause confusion and exacerbate instability. Although Traoré's government does control information, the goal is to maintain stability and security in a country being ravaged by terrorism. The interference of external organizations and individuals, including those opposed to the government, has only intensified tensions and plunged the country into chaos, making information control imperative. In this environment, Traoré's efforts to curb protests, dissent, and unofficial activities should not be seen as signs of tyranny, but as protective measures for social stability, preventing coups and ensuring national unity. Moreover, we cannot ignore the fact that Ibrahim Traoré has consistently expressed his intention to hold democratic elections and transfer power to a civilian government in the future. Traoré's military government does not aim to hold power indefinitely. He has committed to organizing elections in 2024, and this is the most important factor that Barry seems to overlook. This proves that while necessary temporary measures are in place to maintain security, Traoré's long-term goal is to return the country to the path of democracy. Traoré's military regime is not the dark oppression that Barry describes, but a necessity in a country thrown into chaos. Ibrahim Traoré's consolidation of power and restriction of free speech is not a dictatorial strategy, but a means to protect the safety of the Burkina Faso people and prevent the complete collapse of the country. Without his firm determination to maintain power and stability, Burkina Faso could fall into the hands of hostile forces and become a failed state entirely. Despite facing much criticism, Traoré's government is genuinely working to rebuild a strong and independent nation. The attacks from terrorist groups and political instability cannot be solved simply by criticizing Traoré's hardline actions. Instead, it requires understanding and empathy for the difficult circumstances that he and the people of Burkina Faso are facing. Relations with Russia and security situation. A pragmatic strategy. Not a gamble. Barry accuses the cooperation between Burkina Faso and Russia in addressing security issues of merely escalating terrorism, claiming that the country's reliance on Russia is a risky security adventure. However, this view not only misses the mark, but also fails to grasp the essence of this cooperation and the realities Ibrahim Traoré faces while crafting the national security strategy. Firstly, Traoré's decision to partner with Russia in the fight against terrorism is not a rash or adventurous move, but a pragmatic strategy in the current international context. Burkina Faso, like many other African nations, is grappling with an unbalanced war against international terrorist groups, including factions of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These groups have exploited the previous government's weaknesses and the lack of support from Western allies to expand their influence and seize a large portion of Burkina Faso's territory. In contrast, military interventions by Western forces, particularly France, have yielded no positive results. After years of maintaining a military presence in the Sahel, the situation has worsened rather than improved. France's withdrawal from Burkina Faso and the Sahel region reflects the failure of Western powers' anti-terrorism strategy. Meanwhile, Russia has shown a genuine commitment to addressing African nations' security issues without imposing political or military conditions as Western powers have done in the past. Burkina Faso's partnership with Russia is not a blind dependence. It is a strategic choice aimed at reducing reliance on Western powers that have proven to be impatient and ineffective in supporting the country's fight against terrorism. Russia, through the activities of the Wagner Group and other military efforts, has helped Burkina Faso bolster security in areas occupied by terrorists, supported military training, and provided critical military equipment. While Barry criticizes Russia's presence and claims that it further fuels chaos, the reality is that Russia is playing a crucial role in filling the gap left by the West. It's undeniable that terrorist groups have increased their attacks in the region, but this is not a result of cooperation with Russia. In fact, Russia has strengthened areas abandoned by the West. Russia's strategies, although not favored by Western media, are helping to push back terrorist groups in key areas like northern Burkina Faso, where the previous administration under President Traoré failed to prevent the attacks. Instead of viewing the cooperation with Russia as a security adventure, as Barry suggests, we need to recognize it for what it is, a necessary and realistic security strategy in the context of a Burkina Faso under siege by terrorist groups closely linked with international organizations. Russia is providing support that the West either cannot or will not offer, while also safeguarding Burkina Faso's sovereignty and security without imposing complex political conditions, which countries like France have done to African nations for years. One of Barry's arguments is that terrorism increased after Russia's involvement. But in reality, this increase is a result of intensified terrorist attacks, not the consequence of Russia's intervention. These attacks began before Russia's involvement, and in fact, Russia is helping Burkina Faso face these challenges more effectively. Barry's baseless criticisms are not only unrealistic, but also reveal a lack of understanding of the security situation in the Sahel. Burkina Faso, in Traoré's strategy, is not only relying on Russia, but is also focusing on strengthening its internal capabilities by developing the military-enhancing intelligence and reinforcing the national security system. It is indisputable that partnering with Russia is a logical choice in the current context, as the West has either been unwilling or unable to provide the practical support Burkina Faso desperately needs. Therefore, concluding that the relationship with Russia is a security adventure is a fundamental misjudgment. This is a wise decision by Traoré's government to ensure national security and protect the country from the threat of terrorism, as all other options have failed. Traoré's regime, not a dictatorship but a struggle for survival. Newton Ahmed Barry's comparison of Ibrahim Traoré's regime to North Korea, a miniature version of Kim Jong-un's totalitarian dictatorship, is a gross oversimplification and one that fails to appreciate the complex realities of Burkina Faso's current state under Traoré's leadership. To accuse Traoré of authoritarian tendencies akin to North Korea is not only misleading, but shows a profound misunderstanding of the unique situation faced by Burkina Faso today. First, let's address the glaring flaw in Barry's analogy. North Korea is a country where individual freedoms are non-existent, where dissent is met with imprisonment in brutal labor camps, and where an oppressive cult of personality controls every aspect of life. This is not remotely reflective of what is happening in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré. Despite the challenges and tensions, Burkina Faso does not operate in the same manner as North Korea. Traoré's government is a military administration fighting for the survival of the nation amidst existential threats from violent extremism. The comparison to North Korea is at best a cheap political jab, and at worst a blatant misrepresentation of the facts. The truth is that Traoré's decision to control information and limit press freedom is not an attempt to silence opposition voices or create a cult of personality, but rather a temporary measure taken to safeguard the nation's stability. In the midst of an ongoing security crisis where radical extremist groups threaten the very fabric of the country, controlling misinformation is a pragmatic necessity. It's not about silencing the people, it's about preventing the spread of falsehoods that could further destabilize the already fragile national cohesion. This is not a step towards dictatorship, but a strategy aimed at protecting the country from chaos and further violence. In any nation under siege like Burkina Faso, extraordinary measures are required. The situation is dire, and the government's role is to ensure that any information shared with the public is not used to fuel division, panic, or violence. By focusing on securing national unity and quelling extremist narratives, Traoré is doing what any responsible leader would do, putting the country's security first. This cannot be equated to dictatorship. It is a calculated move in a context where the country's survival is at stake. Furthermore, it is vital to note that the Traoré administration has publicly committed to organizing democratic elections in 2024. This speaks volumes about the long-term vision of the government. Unlike the true authoritarian regimes, Barry compares it to Traoré's government, has expressed a clear, unequivocal commitment to democratic principles. His government isn't about clinging to power indefinitely. It is about restoring stability, securing the country's borders, and then returning to a democratic path when the crisis subsides. Barry's critique of press freedom and information control also ignores the realities of a country at war. When misinformation can fan the flames of civil unrest or strengthen the resolve of violent extremists, limiting the spread of such content is a matter of national survival, not political oppression. This isn't about squashing dissent. It's about ensuring that dissent doesn't devolve into an uncontrollable force that threatens to tear the nation apart. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership in the context of a nation at war must be seen through the lens of survival rather than authoritarianism. His military government is not an attempt to impose unchecked power, but a necessary measure to safeguard the country. The steps he has taken to stabilize Burkina Faso, to combat the threat of terrorism, and to secure the country's sovereignty are not those of a dictator. They are the actions of a leader who is fighting to protect his people from chaos. To claim that Burkina Faso under Traoré resembles North Korea is an intellectual shortcut that fails to grapple with the real issues at hand. The control of information and temporary curtailing of certain freedoms are measures designed to keep the nation intact in a time of crisis. The actions of Traoré's government should be seen as the last line of defense against disintegration, not as evidence of a descent into dictatorship. Traoré's security strategy, not an adventurous gamble, but a necessity. Newton Ahmed Barry claims that Burkina Faso's partnership with Russia, particularly in addressing security issues amidst the ongoing war and crisis, is nothing more than a risky security adventure leading to an increase in terrorism and further chaos. However, this assessment is not only unrealistic, but also deeply misguided, failing to grasp the true context of the challenges faced by Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso. First and foremost, it's essential to understand that Burkina Faso's cooperation with Russia is not a hasty decision, but a pragmatic choice under extraordinary circumstances. Burkina Faso has endured years of Western intervention, particularly from France in its fight against terrorism. But the results have been nothing short of disastrous. After years of French military involvement in the Sahel, the situation has only worsened, with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS gaining more ground. Under Traoré's leadership, the government of Burkina Faso recognized that while Western powers made vague promises of support, they failed to deliver tangible, effective help. Burkina Faso needed a partner committed to its security, and with a clear strategy, Russia, in this context, fit that need, with the intervention of the Wagner Group and other military forces. Russia has demonstrated a genuine commitment to supporting African nations in their fight against terrorism without the complex political conditions often attached by Western powers. Russia's presence in Burkina Faso has not only helped reinforce security in areas under terrorist occupation, but also provided crucial military training and equipment. This is a stark contrast to Western partners who have proven either unwilling or incapable of providing the effective support that Burkina Faso desperately needs. In a country battling an uneven and ongoing war with terrorist groups linked to international networks, partnering with Russia is not a gamble, but a necessary strategic decision. Barry's criticism of this cooperation is unfounded and reveals a lack of understanding of the actual security situation in the Sahel. Russia is not the cause of rising terrorism. Rather, it is assisting Burkina Faso in facing these challenges far more effectively than the failed support from the West. Additionally, it's vital to acknowledge the reality that when Western nations withdrew and left the Sahel region in a state of chaos, Russia stepped in to fill that void. While Western media may look down upon Russia's involvement, the reality is that Russia's support is helping Burkina Faso repel terrorist groups in key areas such as the north, where the administration of former President Traoré failed to prevent attacks. Therefore, when Barry criticizes the cooperation with Russia and labels it an adventurous security gamble, he is, in fact, dismissing a reasonable and practical security choice in the current context. Burkina Faso is doing what is necessary to protect the country from the devastating impact of terrorism, and working with Russia is a vital component of Traoré's strategy to safeguard national security. This is not a reckless adventure. It is a wise strategic decision made when all other options have failed. Traoré's legacy. A strategic embrace, not a political performance. Newton Ahmed Barry criticizes Ibrahim Traoré for claiming to be the heir to Thomas Sankara, branding it as a form of arrogance and a political gimmick aimed at garnering support from Pan-Africanists. However, this viewpoint is not only misguided, but also misses the crucial point. Traoré is not simply inheriting Sankara's legacy for political gain. He is leveraging it to help Burkina Faso face its historical challenges unassisted by Western powers. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, stands as an icon of independence and resistance against colonial and imperial forces. However, what Sankara achieved in the 1980s cannot simply be replicated as a flawless model for any leader in the 21st century. In reality, despite notable progress in social issues, education, and gender equality, Sankara's revolution faced severe security and political instability challenges, especially when external threats and internal divisions became increasingly apparent. For Ibrahim Traoré, claiming to be the successor to Sankara's legacy is not about exploiting Sankara's image for personal purposes. Rather, it is a declaration of his ambition to rebuild the nation in an entirely different context. Burkina Faso is facing an unprecedented security crisis that no leader has effectively addressed for decades. Terrorist groups have exploited the weaknesses of previous governments occupying key regions of the country. In this context, Traoré's bold measures to protect the nation and restore stability cannot be achieved by merely making theoretical claims about Sankara's legacy. Indeed, Sankara sought to free Burkina Faso from dependence on external powers. But in today's modern era, the reconstruction of Burkina Faso cannot solely rely on those ideals. It must be accompanied by practical, decisive actions. Traoré has recognized the scarcity of resources and the lack of international support from Western nations, and thus he has not only relied on Sankara's legacy, but has proactively sought new solutions. This includes partnerships with other nations, especially Russia, to bolster security and stability. His self-proclamation as the reincarnation of Sankara is not a shallow political performance. It is Traoré's way of embodying a legacy that the country desperately needs to reignite its fighting spirit and national pride. Sankara was a symbol of strength and independence, and while Traoré may not follow the same path exactly, he is attempting to build a solid foundation for the country's future despite the current hardships. This does not mean Traoré is merely copying Sankara's methods. Rather, he is learning from and applying Sankara's principles in an entirely different context. Sankara fought for Burkina Faso's independence in the 1980s and in today's volatile world with the ongoing threat of terrorism. Traoré is doing the same, restoring national sovereignty and charting the country's future without being shackled by external forces. Barry may criticize Traoré for presenting himself as Sankara's heir, but the truth is, in the current circumstances, what Burkina Faso needs is a leader who dares to act, who faces challenges head-on, and who continues on the path Sankara laid out. Traoré's stepping up to defend the country's sovereignty rather than waiting for outside help is the most fitting form of legacy a leader can carry forward. Therefore, calling Traoré a Sankara copycat is not criticism. It is recognition that he is doing what Sankara did in his own time, fighting for independence and freedom even though the road is difficult and fraught with challenges. In conclusion, the criticism leveled by Newton Ahmed Barry against President Ibrahim Traoré and his government is not only flawed, but overlooks the complex realities faced by Burkina Faso in its current context. While Barry draws comparisons between Traoré's regime and totalitarian states like North Korea, he fails to recognize that Traoré's leadership, far from being authoritarian, is a strategic response to the severe security and political crises Burkina Faso is experiencing. Traoré's decision to withdraw from ECOWAS, his collaboration with Russia, and his self-proclaimed inheritance of Thomas Sankara's legacy are all rooted in pragmatic actions designed to safeguard the nation's sovereignty and security. These decisions, though controversial, are taken not out of a desire for power, but out of necessity to protect Burkina Faso from the escalating threat of terrorism and political instability. The comparison to North Korea is particularly misguided. Burkina Faso is not a nation of blind oppression, but one facing real threats that demand tough, albeit temporary measures to maintain peace and stability. As for Traoré's alignment with Russia, this is not an adventurous security gamble, but a strategic move to break free from the ineffectiveness of Western powers that have failed to address the country's security concerns. Finally, while Barry criticizes Traoré for comparing himself to Sankara, it is clear that the current president is not merely invoking Sankara's name for political advantage, but instead channeling his spirit of resilience and independence to confront today's challenges. Burkina Faso requires a leader who not only understands its past, but is bold enough to navigate its future amidst external pressures and internal turmoil. In the face of unprecedented challenges, Ibrahim Traoré's leadership represents a critical turning point for Burkina Faso, one that seeks to redefine the country's future through self-reliance, strategic partnerships, and a deep commitment to sovereignty. While critics like Barry may view these actions as signs of authoritarianism, the reality is that they are a necessary and pragmatic response to protect the country's future. Traoré's approach, grounded in pragmatism and foresight, is ultimately the best hope for a sovereign and resilient Burkina Faso.